fine. The main roads are fine. It's a wet. The snow is like a month early. It's a spring snow. Everything, the people that shoveled my walk, it's all dried off now. It's fine. So don't worry. And my wife went, it's something that I don't do. She got her hair done. And,
well, Marshall has spoken.
Yes.
Marshall says it's safe, so I'm good with that.
Me too.
Well, I live right on Quebec, so I've been watching Quebec outside.
My joke is I have two hairstylists, a male and a female. The male his name is Ray Zor, and the female, her name is Jill Lett.
That's funny. Razor, like shave it.
I do.
Hey, Margie.
Hey, Arnie, how are you?
This book is good.
Oh, I'm so glad. Bob hates it.
Huh? You picked it? Okay.
He hates it. It'll be a wonderful discussion then. We'll have lots of different opinions.
What book is it?
It's
yeah.
Hi guys.
Go ahead, Margie, you tell me.
It's The Hare with the Amber Eyes. No?
No,
It's kind of late 1800s, and it talks about the super rich Jews like in Europe at the time and their collectors. And that's, it's just remarkable. I mean, it's interesting how anti-Semitic, even though this is the upper echelon of wealth,
And the artists, yeah.
We'll get started in 1 second. I just have to tell you first, Arnie. So Arnie's got his granddaughter is the cutest thing on the face of the planet. And I was with her on Tuesday, and I was with a couple kids outside doing story time. And I said to them, I said, all right, my friends, I got to go back and go back to my meeting. And Margot, his granddaughter, says to me, my Zadie watches your meetings, comes to your meetings. So first she leaned over to a kid and said, why does she have to go to a meeting? And the other one leaned over because she's the rabbi. Oh my God, so much cuteness in these little tiny packages. Oh, I love them. But I want to make sure we have enough time to learn together today. I see everybody's still popping in. So welcome everyone. We are going to do a little bit different today. We're looking at a topic based on something that came up in the news this week that I thought was interesting and worth some of our time to study. Yoni has just put the article in the chat. Thank you, Yoni. And we'll share it and we'll look at it in a moment. I'd like to set a few sort of first pieces. The article is about Rush Limbaugh's death and how people have responded to it. That's what we're going to look at today and what Judaism guides us with this, about a tension between a couple different things. We're going to talk about it. I'd like to set the first precedent that I do not believe everyone in our congregation believes the same thing. I have no interest in a congregation where we all believe the same thing. This is one of the beauties of a community. There's a lot of conversation now within the URJ about people who will say, I work in a purple congregation, as in red and blue, as in Democrat and Republicans in the congregation. I think we all work in purple congregations. There are just not always space for everyone to feel comfortable speaking and acknowledging that. I believe everyone should have space in our congregation, independent of who you vote for in a private ballot, and would like us to sort of operate with an understanding that everybody comes to things from a different perspective and that not everybody necessarily agrees, right? That would be sort of my beginning caveat. Let's all start from this place. So we'll first we have to start, of course, with our blessing for Torah study. So we say Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praising God for the opportunity and the commandment to engage with our tradition and to engage with our current world and how our Jewish values and tradition can help us meet those questions. So that's what we're looking at today. So this article came out in The Atlantic. The link is in your chat, and I can put it up on the screen in a moment. And the title is called Death is Nothing to Celebrate. It was written by Rabbi David Wolpe. Are people familiar with him? Is that a name anybody knows? Rabbi David Wolpe, very, probably one of the most well-known American rabbis, I would say, who's not part of ultra-Orthodoxy. He's a conservative rabbi in LA, really interesting, very smart man who has offered a lot of really wonderful teaching in the last many years. And I'll tell you my favorite David Wolpe story, just to sort of be a little bit of context for us on who he is. Anybody know who Frank Luntz is?
Mhm.
Frank Luntz? So he's a political commenter, pollster, Republican, pretty right wing, on Fox pretty often. And he was speaking to a group of rabbinical students that I was in through a fellowship with APAC. And if those of you who were at our APAC Zoom a few months ago heard this, but he was speaking, and the only person in the room who wasn't a part of this rabbinic student fellowship was David Wolpe. Why? Because Franklin said, I never felt like I had space as a politically conservative leaning Jew. I never felt I have space, and this man made space for me. He said, we agree on nothing politically. So we agree on nothing politically, but I would follow that man to the ends of the earth because he made room for me. So a little bit of background that's my David Wolpe story. Is not everybody has a David Wolpe story, but I have one, and that's it. And just a little bit of context on who he is. He is a politically left-leaning person, and has made effort to make room for people. So I would offer that as a little caveat. So the article we're looking at was in The Atlantic, as I said. Just check. It came out this week, and it's talking about the death of Rush Limbaugh, and about people who were reveling in his death. Oh, great recommendation from Pam in the chat about one of Rabbi Wolpe's books. People reveling in the death of Rush Limbaugh. Okay, and so here's one of the pieces I want to lift up. Rabbi Wolpe says, in my more than 30 years as a rabbi, I have stood at the graves of many people. Some were kind and others less so. Some had a reputation that any of us would envy. Others had ruined their public standing through acts or words that followed them throughout their life. But what consistently struck me was the raw, depthless fact of grief. We're going to skip a little bit here. Death is impossible to understand. That someone with whom I shared a moment yesterday who was vivid and alive is now in a box and being lowered into the ground forever is not a fact that the brain can comprehend. And to see such grief over and over makes it impossible to view death as frivolous or an occasion for jubilation. So he's responding here that there are many who have been very public about celebrating Rush Limbaugh's death. And so we're looking at this from a Jewish perspective. What do we do with this? Okay, I want to look at a few more pieces of the article, and then we'll look at some text. Would someone read this for us? These two paragraphs right here. Would someone like to read? I'm already sick of my voice today. Margie.
Sure. The impulse to celebrate the death of one's enemies is very human. When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy, the book of Proverbs says. The passage is descriptive, of course, not prescriptive, but there is nonetheless a recognition of the upsurge of excitement at seeing someone you detest leave this earth. At the Red Sea, the children of Israel sang as the Egyptians who had pursued them drowned. But Proverbs also says, do not be glad when your enemy falls. The Talmud relates that when the angels joined in the celebration at the Red Sea, they were rebuked by God for rejoicing. And today, when Jews commemorate their exodus from Egypt at the Passover Seder, we take a drop of wine from the cup to mark the diminishment of joy we should feel at death, even the death of our enemies. Feelings cannot always be regulated, but the reality of death supervenes, and any expression of happiness should be tempered by sadness.
So we have a tension here that we're going to look at. This happens often. Our tradition says two things that seemingly contradict, and how do we reconcile these? So what are the two pieces we're looking at here? What's in tension?
What's the intention of the two pieces?
What is in tension. What are the two pieces that we're
gotcha.
looking at? Sorry. It's one of those. You could go either way. Every time someone uses the word majority, I think they're saying my name. Every time. You know, you hear what you hear. Majority. I hear Jordy. Yeah. What is in tension here? What are the two pieces?
It's what you plan to do or want to do. You say, well, when this happens, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do this or that.
I think it's this, whether somebody's agreeing with you or you're disagreeing with them.
Okay.
I think it's sometimes we have a mental intention, like we would like to say good riddance to someone who has not been what we consider a decent human being. And I think then, so there's the mental intention and there's the physical intention that you know from all the people standing around mourning that there are people who feel differently than you, and you are there to be respectful of them. And so there has to be a physical intention also.
Interesting. Everything everyone has said is really interesting. Thank you for sharing. I actually think we've got some really clear pieces we can juxtapose against each other from the book of Proverbs. Here's number 1. When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy. Here's number 2. Do not be glad when your enemy falls. To me, and maybe someone else has a way to rationalize that doesn't put it there, but to me, those feel in direct conflict, right? How do we rejoice when the wicked falls and not celebrate? How do you do that? Do not be glad, and there are shouts of joy when the wicked perish. Margie, yeah.
Yeah, so the first one is a normal reaction, a relief from people who have been unburdened by the evil they experienced with whoever. And then the second one is more of a thoughtful, okay, but there might be repercussions from that. So really what we need to do is think a little deeper and think about the fact that the person or people are gone. And had they actually experienced some sort of teshuvah while they were alive, that would have been better than losing them in that phase. That's just one way to kind of think about it, and celebration is very different. To me, to celebrate the death of evil is really different than what was the first one? What?
Shouts of joy.
Shouts of joy. Yeah, that's like an impulsive reaction.
Interesting.
I have a little different take on it. I see it as internal conflict within yourself.
Too.
I remember when Nixon died. I really disliked Nixon in the 70s. And when he died, I was sad and happy. There was an internal conflict because he was a man, he was a human being, and no human being does only bad and no human being does only good. And a friend one time said that when they die, everyone becomes a saint. But, everyone looks at the good things that people did versus the bad things.
Yeah, I think, and I'd also like to offer another caveat here that this conversation is actually not about Rush Limbaugh, right? The article was about Rush Limbaugh. Our conversation isn't. I don't have an opinion. I don't care particularly what your opinion of Rush Limbaugh is. We're not talking about, do we celebrate Rush Limbaugh's death? We're talking about someone who, and everybody's got them, right? Someone who you believe to be evil or bad or terrible. Hitler. Could probably all agree on that one, right? That's probably a safe one in this Zoom room, right? Hitler, not a good person, right? And how do we respond to the downfall of someone we believe to be terrible. And so whether it's Hitler or it's a less extreme example, right? Whoever it is for us personally, that's what we're talking about. And so I just want to clarify that we're not talking about Rush Limbaugh. And if you loved Rush Limbaugh, I don't want you to be offended by this conversation. We're looking at the question of how you do this and less about being tied to any person.
I immediately thought about Hitler. And he's a human being, but he was a terrible human being. And how could a Jew not be happy that that guy died? Period.
Here's the hard piece, right? Judaism, I saw you, Margie. Judaism above all else values life, right? What do we talk about? Pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh is the preservation of the soul, is preservation of life. That drives so many of our decisions and our decision making. Even in ultra-Orthodox, right? You can break anything for pikuach nefesh, to save a life, right? Anything. Preservation of life is as high as it gets for us. We value being alive. And so you look at someone terrible who died and you say, that's a life that was lost. What do I do with that? That's a life that even if I hated this person, right? They had a mother, they had a father, they had someone who loved them in their world. Someone is experiencing a loss here, right? That's one of the ways you look at it. And even if they don't have someone in their world who loved them, it's a loss of life. And any loss of life we treat with sadness at some level, right? If you believe in the supremacy of living, where does that line stop? I saw Margie and then I saw Kathy.
I was just going to say that I sort of like the Grogger solution, where if somebody's truly been evil and there's history and witnesses, so that we could put, Hitler on a Grogger too. But the other thing that I'm thinking is, and I certainly understand the Pikuach nefesh, but it is more complicated, and that's what I thought when I read the article, because people I know, death is supposedly not understandable, but we certainly understand a lot of things about it. And to me, facing death can and should help us to be better humans. So, a little bit different than Wolpe's take.
Yeah, but a great point. Kathy, did you want to share something?
Yeah, two things now. One with Margie, I agree. When I go to a funeral, I always learn something. You learn about the person, they give the history, things you don't know, but also you learn what kind of person they were. Not by, how many people are there, but also what they say about the person, but what the person has done in their life that I may not have been aware of. And I always learn something from that. I learn a lesson of life, and it's from from something the deceased did. So I'm always grateful for that, whether I knew them well or didn't know them or whatever. The second thing, Mike and I watch a lot of late night shows just because we need the comedy at the end of the day. And when Rush Limbaugh died, one of the comedians just said, okay, he died. And it just stopped right there. And then he went on to He Who Shall Not Be Named eulogy and how stupid it was. And that kind of thing. So I think what he did, because this was a very, they're all liberal just about. And he just made it as a statement, no emotion whatsoever, and moved on. And I think with someone who, one thing that, like you said, that we should be very upset or just sad that a life is gone is because everybody can be redeemed. They have to do it themselves, but there's always the hope that they will wake up one day and go, oh boy, was I wrong or evil or something. It's happened. You get people that leave the white nationalists or the whatever hate group, and all of a sudden they wake up and go, oh, this is wrong, and they leave. And it happens. This doesn't happen often enough, I think. But yeah. So yeah, I agree with you that somebody that's evil dies, I think it's okay to mourn the fact that they lost the opportunity to redeem themselves.
Sure. Mark, did I see you up there?
Yes. So if you really hated somebody, but you made their living by talking about them, how would you feel now? You're
Good question. So do you want to explain more?
I don't know if I can explain it. It seems obvious to me.
Do you mean that you lost your source?
Yeah, you lost your source of income.
Mm-hmm.
You lost your job because your job was to be critical and satirical of this guy, who now he can't be the reception. You can't receive that. One thing I really dislike about this last 5 years is that I never had anybody ever come up to me and tell me that I shouldn't watch a certain TV station or listen to a certain radio commentator, except this time. And I had I had a good friend for like 25 years who the friendship stopped because of that.
There's been a lot of relationships broken in here because of that. This inability, I actually think what's happened, because I'm really disturbed by what's happened culturally and societally in the last 5 years and the way we speak to one another. And I think it's inherently not Jewish, because what's our tradition? Our tradition is one of sacred dialogue and sacred argument. Talmud, one big transcript of a debate, of an argument. But here's what I love most about Judaism. It's one of my favorite things, right? We come to, on big questions and decisions, we come to a final answer, but the non-prevailing opinion is always preserved, right? Hillel and Shammai argue and argue and argue and argue. Hillel's pretty much always right, but we always know what Shammai said, right? Even if we decide that this is the final answer, this is what we're going to uphold, we preserve all the opinions because they have value to us, right? And acknowledging and respecting the words of others. And so we have devolved into such a place for many reasons, which we could spend many a lunch and learn debating and discussing, but our tradition values disagreement done respectfully. Done respectfully, we value it immensely. And I agree, don't listen to this, don't listen to that. I think listen to anything you want to listen to. This is our responsibility about engaging, right? What is this blessing we just said? Asok b'divrei Torah, to engage in words of Torah, to engage in our world, right? We are an active religion. Some of us just talked about that this morning. We are an active religion. We actively engage. And so we have a responsibility as thinking, breathing humans to understand what's happening in our world and to understand different sides of an issue. I believe it's our responsibility. It's one of the things that makes me so wild. There's a group that came out, I don't know, within the last 10 years called If Not Now. People heard of this? Yeah. If Not Now is a group mostly of my peers. Honestly, it's mostly millennials who are coming out against Israel in a very aggressive way. And one of their big campaigns, I don't know if they're still running it, but a big campaign at one point was the "You Never Told Me," hashtag "You Never Told Me." And all the things that they never learned about Israel growing up, that they didn't learn about in religious school, they didn't learn about here. And here's what makes me wild about that. For sure, could we do a better job? Absolutely. And we have responsibilities as thinking, breathing, living humans to engage in our world. Saying, you didn't tell me about that, and so I get to be mad at you that I didn't know. I don't know that works. We have a responsibility to critically evaluate what we hear, right? Someone tells you the sky is blue. This is a silly example. Someone tells you the sky is blue. Are you going to look up and check, right? Say it's raining. Don't you look out the window when someone says it's raining, right? We check for ourselves. Snowing. Oh, really? Is it snowing? I want to see for myself, right? Not that we don't believe people, right? But we have a responsibility to investigate and engage. And so you watch one news channel, you're getting one slice of the pie. You don't know what the rest of the pie looks like. And I think we have a responsibility as I said, as thinking, breathing humans, and also as Jews, to understand more than what exists past our little slice of pie, our little piece of the world. I'll now get off my soapbox. This is one of the many things that puts me right on up there. Someone had a hand.
Eileen.
Yes, Eileen.
I remember going to a funeral of somebody who was a pedophile. Not to me. I didn't have any experiences with this man, but I knew of him. And when he died, I thought, I don't even know what to think. And I just said, well, there are a lot more little girls around who are safe. And then I thought, God, his soul's yours now. You have to do with it as necessary. And I just gave it to God because I really didn't know what to do.
Thank you for sharing. First of all, this is very hard. This is not easy. This is very difficult. And we're going to look at a few pieces here. I've got some text. I'm going to put it up on the screen. I actually want to go to page 2. So I've put this quote from the article up here again, because I think that what Rabbi Wolpe is juxtaposing is really the crux of the issue, right? Is these two pieces from Proverbs. When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy, and do not be glad when your enemy falls. But I love to go out of my own order. And I want to look at this for a second, because I discovered this week as I was preparing, and I think it's so beautiful and symbolizes a lot. So we have in the traditional Amidah, the central section of our prayers, we have all of these different blessings that we say on weekdays, right? So we're often in Reform spaces a little less familiar with them because we are more familiar with Shabbat liturgy. But if we're going to look, actually, you know what I'm going to do? Let me pull up our prayer book. Really
Excuse me, Rabbi, can you increase the size of the
yeah, I can make
it's becoming an eye test for me.
I will make it bigger. So I'm going to pull up our weekday prayer book. Let me open this up, and I will make it bigger. I have multiple things on my screen at once, and I forget that it goes through small for you if I do that. In an effort to try and see your faces. So this is our flip book. If you aren't familiar with this, you can link this you can get to it from our website. It's really, really useful. It's our whole prayer book. All right. Oh, hold on. I got to get through the morning. Go. So our weekday Amidah is different. And those of you who took the prayer class, we talked about this a bit. Our weekday prayers are different because we have an extra section of asking for things. On Shabbat, we aren't doing the asking. We're doing the praising and the thanking. Okay, so here we are. So if you're not familiar with how our prayer book operates, see, this is weird. So on the sides here, can you see this? I think you should be able to see this. On the sides here, there's like a guiding rubric, right? And it's in English on the left and Hebrew on the right. And it walks you through the sections. So all of these are part of the Amidah. On Shabbat, we only do this first one and this last one. But look at all of these prayers in the middle. Those are weekday. We only do those on weekday because we're asking for things. So if we look at them, let me get through the first 3. Hold on. So they're short, the way we have them presented here, and they're mostly short in most representations. So the first one is grace in God who gives us knowledge, right? Even if they don't feel like they're directly asking for things, you can maybe construe these as being directed to God for asking for things, or, when you say thank you for something, but it means I want more of it, that kind of thing. So here's one, right? Salach lanu ki chatanu. It's language we use at High Holidays. Forgive us for we've sinned, right? Praise God, the forgiving God, right? So we've got all of these different blessings. And in our prayer book, we've got a little bit of a challenge because some of these have been changed. And some of us studied this a little bit last year in person. So it was like another lifetime ago. But we have a blessing traditionally called Birkat HaMinim, which is a blessing for heretics. So in our prayer book here, it's been changed to al-harisha. Al-harisha for wickedness. So here's the modern version of the blessing. It says, and for wickedness, let there be no hope, and may all the errands return to you, and may the realm of wickedness be shattered. Blessed are you, Adonai, whose will it is that the wicked vanish from the earth. Okay. Love a little blessing. Not what the original says. Okay. Here's what a traditional blessing says. It's Birkat HaMinim. Minim are heretics. Here's the traditional language. And let me make it bigger. My apologies. Hold on. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. And for slanderers, may there be no hope, and may all wickedness be destroyed instantly, and may all your enemies be cut down quickly. Quickly uproot, smash, and cast down arrogant sinners, and humble them quickly in our days. Blessed are you, O Lord, who breaks enemies and humbles arrogant sinners. Reactions to that blessing? It's pretty harsh.
It's pretty sharp, pretty harsh.
Exactly. I like Alan's word better. Sharp. It's pretty sharp. Right? Aggressive, harsh, whatever we might want to call it. It's firm.
It works in Hebrew if you don't know Hebrew.
We talked about that a lot in the class, right?
No, I think that we're using modern day standards to judge something that was really old, because I keep getting, tied up in this thing with enemies. And I think a lot of these enemies were actual physical enemies who threatened their lives. And maybe I'm just thinking that way right now because I'm reading about 1700 Scotland. And, it wasn't matter, they had these big wars about who was going to rule on things, and it was a matter of life or death. And they were the enemies. And sometimes they'd kill someone and look down at a 14-year-old or 15-year-old face and say, I'm really sad. He hasn't had a chance to live. But the kid would have killed him, And I don't know if we're getting the modern perspective, looking into something really old mixed up, or I don't know about that. I feel a little uncomfortable about that.
Thank you for raising it. This is something I think about often, and it's an issue of what we call historical relativism.
Yes.
Right. And so everything's, I sound like a broken record, everything's always about balance, right? And things are in tension. So looking at something, let's say, rape of Dinah. Dinah is raped in our text, right? In the Tanakh. Dinah is raped. So looking at that story, here are the two pieces. We could look at it with a 2021 lens and be really, really horrified, right? Looking at it as though it happened in 2021. That's not reading the text with the context of its time. And historical relativism, this is the issue. We don't want to look at that and say, well, it's okay because it was a different time. We don't have to do that either, right? We should understand the context in which something happened. But just because it happened a long time ago, in which that time was different, doesn't mean we have to be okay with it now. Does that make sense? We're looking for a balance here. Let me acknowledge this. Here's a great one. Purim. Purim's tonight, right? What happens at the beginning of the Purim story? We heard of Queen Vashti, right? So Queen Vashti, there's a great, actually, I'm going to show you this right here. Hold on. Yeah, I think it's in my bag. So Queen Vashti, what happens in the story with Vashti? The king says, dance for me. And she says, no. And she's banished. Fabulous kids book came out this year called Queen Vashti's Comfy Pants. The whole thing is in rhyming form. And her big refrain is, I will not don my royal crown or change into a fancy gown. I'm not in the mood to dance, for I am in my comfy pants. It's this whole thing about standing up for yourself. Read it to Margot this week, Arnie. It's a whole thing about standing up for yourself, right? But the Vashti story is fascinating. So if we look at it and piece it and pick it apart, Vashti we could view as an abused woman, right? She's brought out, told to dance, show off her stuff. She probably wasn't just dancing, right? The king trots her out when he wants. Vashti says no, and out she goes, and we keep going with the story, right? We just keep going on. Vashti gets no more FaceTime because she's no longer useful, because she's no longer just compliant and rolling on through, right? So how do we look at that story and take issue or struggle with something and acknowledge it in that time period. I don't have to be okay that King Ahasuerus treated her that way and that that's in our tradition's story. And I don't get to be as mad as I would be in 2021 for something that happened in these times in Persia. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
There's something in between where we value context, but we don't overvalue. And where we value our modern perspective, but we don't infuse it too much so that we are reading the text in a way that's not inherently fair to it.
Well, I think Margie was first.
Yeah, Margie.
You were first.
Oh, but do we need to acknowledge that without Vashti, there wouldn't be the Purim story?
So yeah, Vashti is a really important part of our Purim story. I think we don't, this is how we can look at it in a reasonable light, right? We can say, looking at it through our modern values, I'd like to lift up Vashti's voice in the Purim story. I'd like to talk more about Vashti, right? I'd like to write a book about Vashti, right? That's not about Esther and Mordecai. It's about Vashti saying, no, I'm in my comfy pants, which if we could ever relate to being in your comfy pants and not wanting to take them off, it's this year. I mean, it just came out. So clearly a product of quarantine, a book about wearing your comfy pants and refusing to change. So clearly a quarantine friendly book. But absolutely, we can look at it and say, I would like to lift this up. I'd like to acknowledge Vashti's role in this story beyond being a little footnote at the beginning.
And that's a thing I know I've used with my kids when there's, when they run into some important issues that, you know, I disagree with, but want them to make up their own mind. One of the things that comes up a lot is you can always learn how not to be from a situation, from a person, from a, you know, and they seem to really like that as opposed to you're an immediate enemy. I can learn something from everybody.
Absolutely. Other thoughts?
Well, yeah, we're sort of getting off the death thing, but wasn't in Dina's time, if you were raped, you were disgraced unless the person who raped you married you? And wasn't that part of the reason why this family was supporting the son marrying the daughter and
yeah,
Dina's father wiped him out, or father and brothers wiped him out? So that was a whole different kind of thing. He wanted to marry her. Dina's family probably would have never approved it since they weren't Jewish, I don't think. And so that was a way to marry her. You know, it's a whole different history.
Right?
It's like the Vashti story. It's a whole different time period. But you know, so I guess the thing would be was, well, were they justified in killing the man who raped her and his brothers and the father and whatever? Were her brother and fathers justified in killing? You know, death after death. I mean, it's just it's a horrible thing, but it's such a different attitude than we have now.
Absolutely. So this is how we do this balance, right? We understand the way that rape worked in those times, right? And acquiring a woman. We want to understand those things. It doesn't mean it has to feel okay to me.
Yeah, I agree.
I need to understand the context, right? Before I can start to infuse my time's perspective on it. Mark, was that a little hand I saw?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that rape in those societies that treated it like that, now treat it as the woman's fault. The rape doesn't have anything to do with the man. He could, if it's his daughter, he can kill his daughter even if she was raped.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, this all gets really complicated, and this is one of our challenges of our days: is how do I reconcile what I believe, influenced by the time I'm living in, with the fact that all of these pieces are part of our tradition from another time. So this is one of them, and one of the responses is to edit it, right? So the version of this blessing, oh, I'm not in a PDF, my apologies. That's why the little red squiggles are there. We'll just ignore them. So the other one of the responses is to change. With liturgy, we can do that. Liturgy evolves, right? Tanakh does not. Tanakh stays the same. We can get a little flowery with our translation. We can get a little more interpretive with it. But liturgy, there's more freedom. And so the editors of Mishkan Tefillah, our current prayer book, have chosen to tone this prayer down a little. But this is the original. This is where it comes from. Birkat Hamimi, right? Blessing against the heretics. That they should essentially die, right? Uproot, smash, and cast down the sinners.
And that God should be in charge of doing that and help them.
Absolutely, right? Praying for this. It's aggressive. So I want to look at where this comes from. So here in the Talmud, right? We're in Talmud Brachot 28b. And so I've preserved with this bolding and not bolding situation. This is how things come through on Sefaria. I don't know if any of you have been playing with Sefaria. I know Yoni, I think, has done some training around it to help us use it as a tool, really wonderful tool. And one of the great things about learning Talmud with Sefaria's translation is they add all kinds of things. So anything, what's bolded is what the text literally says. What's not bolded is all of the context you need to understand what the text says, right? And it's typically fairly well done at this point. So I'm going to read the whole thing through as though it's one narrative piece. My apologies, the Hebrew's missing on here. Hebrew decided to stop working on my computer yesterday. It was a fluke thing. And so there's no Hebrew on this one, and we'll all make it, but know that the Hebrew exists. So here's what Talmud says. In light of the previous mention of the blessing of the heretics, what we're looking at, the Gemara, which is the new stuff the Talmud's introducing, explains how this blessing was instituted. The sages taught, Shimon HaPakuli arranged the 18 blessings, that's the Amidah, already extant during the period of the Great Assembly, before Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, in order in Yavna, right? This is just orienting us to where they all were and that they were working on this. Due to prevailing circumstances, there was a need to institute a new blessing directed against the heretics. Rabban Gamliel said to the sages, is there any person who knows to institute the blessing of the heretics, a blessing directed against the Sadducees? Shmuel HaKatan, who was one of the most pious men of that generation, stood and instituted it. So saying there was a need for this blessing. They felt a need. Let's also understand the time period these rabbis are in. Rabbis of the Talmud are extraordinarily concerned about Jewish continuity, right? How will this keep going? And they're very afraid of the other, right? Of other peoples. Sometimes it's really well-based because sometimes people want to kill us, right? That's a theme of our history. And sometimes that's about a fear of intermixing and losing Judaism that way, right? Where we get all kinds of, some of our kashrut rituals are about not being able to sit and break bread with non-Jews, right? Because we're concerned about a continuity and a continuation of the Jewish people and a Jewish existence. So they're really afraid, and they say, we need this blessing. And so who comes to institute this blessing? Who comes to save the day?
Shmuel HaKatan.
Shmuel HaKatan. Here's the other mention we have of Shmuel HaKatan. It's in Pirkei Avot. So Pirkei Avot is Mishnah. We don't always call it Mishnah because we've sort of elevated it to its own status. Pirkei Avot, we call it Ethics of the Fathers or Saying of the Fathers. It's sort of proverb-y, it's little snippets, right, that we have taken out. It's a different meaning when you read it all together, straight through, neither here nor there, a discussion for another day. But so here's what Pirkei Avot says. Shmuel HaKatan said, if your enemy falls, do not exult. If he trips, let your heart not rejoice, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and avert his wrath from him. Proverbs. This entire verse of Mishnah says, Shmuel HaKatan said this, but this is the Proverbs. There's nothing new that he's saying. It's saying Shmuel HaKatan used to quote Proverbs. And what does the Proverbs line say? If your enemy falls, do not exult. If he trips, do not let your heart not rejoice, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and avert his wrath from him. Okay. So even if this is a terrible, Proverbs saying, even if this is a terrible person, you still shouldn't rejoice if your enemy falls.
Isn't there a difference between exulting and rejoicing in your heart that nobody knows about?
I don't know. I mean, I think, it depends on your theology at some point, right? Does God know? And it depends if you care, which is a really reasonable question.
Mm.
But
Well,
what's
it's a difference between behavior and thoughts.
for sure. And action and thought. I mean, I think that I believe we have responsibility for the way that we think as well. I think, part of that is about not saying everything we think and putting it out there. But I do think that there's some kind of accountability for your thoughts. Do you ever think something bad and you say, oh my God, I don't like that I thought that way. I don't like how that feels to me. That doesn't feel good or authentic to me. I think we have accountability of what we're thinking as well. Marshall, I see you, and then Margie.
But what if it's somebody you really like or love that has died, but they have been suffering? Shouldn't you be glad that they're no longer suffering?
I think, yes, you absolutely can be. I think that related, I think it's an offshoot. I don't think it's apples to apples, right? I think or if it's apples to apples, it's like a Fuji and a Granny Smith, right? They're slightly different. They're slightly different lanes, for sure. I think now you're starting to look at intention. Why are you rejoicing, right? Why is there joy to you in how they died, in their death?
I get it. I get what you're saying completely, but what bothers me, we have a couple of physicians here too, and you stated, we should do everything we can to preserve life, but sometimes we shouldn't. And when we see people that are really suffering, and I understand halacha and all that other stuff, but it really bothers me when I see somebody suffering and just going on and on and on, and you're helpless.
I agree. And I think, I think about when I was a hospital chaplain, there was once a gentleman in his 90s, and they allowed, so when you code, right, that's when they're doing compressions, causes a lot of trauma to the body. I now speak as a medical professional because I worked in a hospital, not a medical professional. I just play one on TV. It causes a lot of trauma to the body, right? Continued compressions, you can break ribs, all kinds of things. And they let this 96-year-old man code for 25 minutes, just a really long time. And I had a very hard time with that. I got there after they had stopped. I had a really hard time with that because it might have been preservation of life, an attempt at preserving his ability to breathe. And I think preservation of life also means preservation of dignity. I think it's preservation of a quality of life. I think it's preservation of the lives around him that we're going to keep living. I think there's all kinds of factors in there. And so I think that we can expand pikuach nefesh. Interestingly enough, nefesh is a soul. It's not about lifeblood, the term we use for that. It's preservation of the soul. And so I think that's also about well-being. I think it's the same way that in the last year, people have made calculated risks, right? Calculated risks with COVID because of soul preservation. Matthew and I got on a plane in July because we needed to see family. We needed a hug. We needed that experience. We really needed it. That was about preservation of our nefesh. It was worth a little bit of risk to the lifeline. And we all made the choice, right? It's a both, and it's a push and pull. And I think that that's sort of what you're aiming at, is that it's not quite always as simple as keeping someone's heart pumping as the preservation of life.
Yeah, I really see what Marshall is saying. And I think that you can be glad in a way that the pain is over, but you can still be sad that this person who was very meaningful to you or meaningful in life died. So you have these mixed emotions. And I remember when my mother died, I just couldn't get over feeling really down. And then finally, I said to myself, but you're remembering how she was 40 years ago and 50 years ago when you did things to her. You aren't focusing in on how tough the last couple of years have been as she went deeper into dementia. So I think that there are within us all these mixed feelings. And that's fine too. But once I started focusing on that, I wasn't going to think about just all the good things in my mother's life. I was going to think about how much she suffered in the last years. It was much easier to accept the death.
Yeah. Margie, I think, has wanted to speak for a bit. And Mark, I see you also.
Yes, I caught this in my mind, this triangle at the end of that piece we just read. Not to rejoice lest his wrath be averted. And that, to me, that's supposed to be God, right? So if God sees that you're, rejoicing in this situation, then God's going to give him a bye or something. It was just an interesting consequence.
Very interesting. I think it speaks to a very specific understanding of theology that may or may not line up with yours.
Yeah.
Or not you personally. Mark and then Arnie.
I had talked to a guy, Orthodox rabbi, about what he felt about preserving life. And he said, when family gives him responsibility for that, for dealing with the medical people, he would, and they would say, the doctors would ask him, how far do you want us to go? And he says, extraordinary limits, extraordinary circumstances. We need to do everything we can. And they would believe in keeping him alive. What is the saying in the Talmud? If moving his pillow would hasten his death, he can't do that. But then I talked to one Orthodox guy who went to visit another Orthodox guy who had dementia, was in the nursing home. And the older of the two told the younger one, don't bother me now. This is as close I've ever gotten to talking to God.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Arnie, I hear him.
Yeah, let me put this in context. I spent my life as a director of burn center. And, medically you're trained. I don't care if they bring Hitler. You are medically, you've got a different oath. And at that point, you are a functionary of medicine. Okay. With our debriefing sessions, you can picture some of the cases we used to get. Everything from a serial killer who gets bullet in him, and we're in there trying to save him. And people afterwards would say, like, what are we doing? Okay. I was actually very disappointed in that bracha you mentioned that calls upon God to kill something. That implies a vengeful act of God. Prayer, in my mind, should be more like change him. Like God change him. The way we were taught in the debriefing, when we saw something like this, don't rejoice, but mourn the fact that this has occurred. Mourn the fact that this, like that, and with that, you're not, I guess, like I say, it's much more appeasing and much more reconciling for your own psyche. Does that make sense? In other words, and not go after, like, I want God to throw the lightning bolt. That's a mistake. Instead, God, change him. Hitler comes in the door, mourn the fact that Germany or this guy could exist.
Absolutely. I think, I think about this all the time, right? You look at someone like a Hitler, and Hitler was born as a baby screaming his way into the world the way the rest of us were. I don't believe people are born with evil in them, right? Judaism tends not to believe that, right? We say every morning, oh, thank you, God. The soul you have given me is pure. But we all have capacity for goodness. I think that in many people, for a variety of reasons and circumstances, that gets twisted along the way and they lose the capacity, right? I think evil comes in, but at some point, we were all the same. We were crying babies coming into the world, right? And you can talk about being born into privilege and being born into this or that, and all the ways that influences and impacts. But at some level, we were all those babies, and there's always room to mourn that baby could have been something different, right? That baby could have been something different, and that's not what happened. And that's what to be sad about. What I think is really interesting here, and I'd like to bring us back just sort of as our time is dwindling down, back to this moment here. So we looked at this blessing. Let me zoom out a little. We looked at this blessing for the heretics, right? That's aggressive, that's saying, get them all. The Talmud tells us who wrote it, Shmuel HaKatan. And the Mishnah, all it says about Shmuel HaKatan is that he used to say this, Why do we have a whole verse that's just saying that he quoted Proverbs? There's nothing new. Why? The Mishnah is telling us that even the man who wrote a blessing that says they should all die had this idea in mind that you shouldn't rejoice in the death of someone else. Even though he wrote this was also in his mind. To me, it feels like this really interesting acknowledgement that it's very messy, right? That it's not also clean cut in here. That even the guy who wrote this blessing knew and used to tell people all the time, you shouldn't rejoice in the death of someone, death of your enemy. It's not so clean. It's not so simple.
And Jordy, it might be that the experiences he had after that made him see a bigger picture, or a different picture. He maybe saw that the balance was off if you did that.
Yeah, I mean, we are all certainly a product of our experiences, for sure. And so one of the challenges we have is reading about all of these sages in a different time when we don't know their experiences, right? Because that certainly bleeds through. That comes in, right? We can't, typically, it's really hard to separate ourselves from the experiences we've had. They color how we view our world. For better or for worse, it is what it is, right? That's how we view it, right? If you have experienced X, you're going to see other people experiencing that differently, right? If you've experienced this, you're going to see something totally unrelated differently because there may possibly be a connection to something you've experienced. Change how you see the world. And so we don't know. We don't know what their experiences were. I think there's a lot of room and a lot of place for everyone to stand in here. But I think it's a challenge for us to push ourselves on how do we respond to that. I appreciate and value that Rabbi Wolpe has said, we're not going to rejoice in the death of Rush Limbaugh. I think he's right. I support that idea. And I think that there's a lot we can learn from that. And I'd encourage you, anybody who hasn't read the article should read it. And even if you have, go back and reread it after we've spent an hour on this conversation and see what you read and what you get from it on round 2. I want to make sure everyone knows that we have Purim tonight, 6 p.m. We start with a brief service followed by a Megillah reading. Queen Esther, you're looking at her. And at 7 o'clock, we have a comedian coming. He's very funny, as you hope your comedian would be. I'm a big fan. He's going to be with us. He's a Rabbi Michael Danziger. He's in Ohio, and he is going to do a comedy show for us at 7 o'clock, all in the same Zoom room the whole way through. Pop in, out, come to what you're interested in. But we would love to see you there. Awesome.
Thank you, Rabbi Jordy.
Thank you, everybody.